Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to dive into some more history with us today?
Always ready.
All right. Well, today we're going to be looking at kind of the end of the Civil War
Yeah,
and what happened right after.
sounds good.
So the source material that we're using for this is an episode of the American History Tellers podcast,
Okay.
and it's called "Bind Up the Nation's Wounds."
Oh, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah, it is, and I think that anyone who's listening to this show knows a lot about the Civil War already.
Right.
But we're going to be looking at a few stories in here that you may or may not have heard.
Interesting. Okay.
Um, so to set the stage, it's December of 1864,
Right?
and the Union at this point, is feeling really good.
Yeah, they're winning.
They're winning. They've got all the momentum. They've got the manpower. They've got the resources. Lincoln has just given his second State of the Union address,
Okay.
and he's talking about, how they're going to win this thing. It's just a matter of time now.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Confederacy's falling apart.
Yeah. Yeah. Their infrastructure has been devastated. Sherman's march to the sea has really, really crippled them. Food scarce, their currency is worthless.
Yeah. I mean, even at this point, the episode kind of focuses on these two soldiers
Okay.
who were stationed near Petersburg, Virginia.
All right.
And it's January 1865. They're hungry. They're freezing.
Yeah.
They're exhausted. And the letters they're getting from home are really, really sad. Their families are struggling to survive. They're talking about how Fort Fisher has fallen, which was the last major port that the South had.
Oh, wow.
And they're starting to think about, like, should they desert? Should they stay?
Yeah, what's the point?
What's the point?
At this point.
Yeah. And it's interesting, too, because, these stories of desertion speak to that internal pressure that was mounting within the Confederacy as well.
Mm-hmm.
You have the external military pressure, but internally you've got these moral dilemmas, these conflicting loyalties. They're loyal to the cause, they're loyal to their families,
Right.
but ultimately they're also just trying to survive. Yeah. And on top of all this, the Confederacy's trying everything. They're even considering arming slaves, which was super controversial.
Yeah, I mean, even Robert E. Lee himself, who is arguably the most respected figure in the Confederacy, had deep reservations about arming slaves. Think about that for a second.
Wow.
This is a society that's entirely built on the institution of slavery, and yet in their desperation, they're actually contemplating handing weapons to the very people that they have been oppressing.
That's really interesting.
But at the same time that all of this is happening, there are also these glimmers of hope,
Yeah.
In January of 1865, the House of Representatives passes the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery.
Okay.
Now, this doesn't mean immediate freedom for everyone because it still has to be ratified by the states,
Right.
but it's this huge symbolic victory, and it's really a sign that the tide is turning.
Yeah. It makes you think about what those soldiers we were talking about earlier would have thought about that.
Absolutely.
Getting this news that slavery is abolished while they're stuck in these trenches.
Right. And it's against this backdrop of these military defeats and internal struggles that the Confederacy attempts to negotiate peace with Lincoln.
Okay.
In February of 1865, they meet at Hampton Roads.
Okay.
And these peace talks signal a weariness on both sides, a longing for the bloodshed to end.
Sure.
But they're still miles apart on the core issues, The Confederates still want independence, and Lincoln's committed to preserving the Union. Grinds on.
Man.
And that brings us to Sherman's campaign in South Carolina, which is a chapter that's often discussed and debated for its brutality.
Yeah. Sherman's march through South Carolina, I mean, it was brutal.
Oh, absolutely.
It seemed like he saw South Carolina as the heart of the rebellion. It was the birthplace of secession.
Right.
And his troops were definitely ready for payback.
Yeah. They burned, they plundered,
Oh, yeah.
left a trail of destruction in their wake.
And this brings up a question for anyone listening. Was Sherman's campaign a necessary evil to crush the Confederacy, or was it a war crime that inflicted unnecessary suffering on civilians?
It's a question that historians still debate to this day.
Yeah, the podcast even describes a scene where a Union colonel orders his men to burn a farmer's crops and to slaughter her livestock.
Wow.
These weren't military targets. These were people's livelihoods.
Right. And you have to think about the physical terrain that Sherman's army was navigating too. Swamps, rivers, dense forests. It was grueling. And all the while, he's playing these mind games with the Confederates.
Right.
Keeping them guessing about his true target, which was Columbia, the state capital.
So the capture of Columbia was a major turning point.
Oh, absolutely.
But it's also a story shrouded in a lot of controversy, right?
Yes.
The burning of the city, the debate over who started the fires.
Right. Some people blame Sherman's troops. Some blame the retreating Confederate cavalry. The truth may be lost to history, but the result is undeniable. Columbia, a symbol of Confederate power, was in ruins. And it's here with the Confederacy reeling that they make the desperate decision to arm enslaved men.
Just shows how desperate they were.
Yeah.
Imagine being one of those enslaved men offered a weapon to fight for the very system that held you in bondage. What a moral quandary.
It's almost unimaginable. And it underscores the fact that despite their attempts to cling to power, the momentum had irrevocably shifted to the Union. The final act of the war was about to begin. So by March of 1865, the siege of Petersburg had become this brutal stalemate.
Yeah.
Grant's forces had been pounding away at Lee's defenses for months, and the city was just teetering on the brink.
Yeah. It's interesting, though, because looking back, it seems like the fall of Petersburg was inevitable, but at the time it was this really hard-fought battle.
Oh, yeah.
So what made it so hard for Grant to take Petersburg?
Well, think about it. Petersburg was vital for the Confederates. It was a critical supply hub for their capital, Richmond. And on top of that, you've got Robert E. Lee, who was this brilliant defensive strategist. He used Petersburg's fortifications and that really tricky terrain to his advantage. It became a war of attrition, a real grind that pushed both sides to their absolute limits.
It makes you think about those two Confederate soldiers we talked about, dealing with dwindling rations, constant bombardment.
Yeah.
Can you imagine what it must have been like for them, as the noose tightened around Petersburg?
Absolutely. And as all of this is happening, you've got the Confederate leadership in Richmond scrambling. They're facing the very real possibility of defeat.
Right.
And the podcast does a great job of capturing the drama of Richmond's evacuation.
It's pretty wild.
Right.
Civilians are panicking. Confederate soldiers are setting fire to warehouses, trying to keep all those supplies out of Union hands.
Yeah.
And then you have President Jefferson Davis delaying his departure until the last possible minute. Yeah, he's making sure that his wife's carriage and their silverware get loaded onto the train before he finally leaves.
Wow, talk about clinging to the vestiges of power and decorum.
Right, almost like he's in denial, refusing to accept the inevitable. And meanwhile, the city descends into chaos.
Wow.
Looters are running rampant. You have drunken mobs in the streets.
It's a really stark contrast to the disciplined advance of the Union troops who entered Richmond on April 3rd, 1865.
Yeah, and what I find really powerful is that, among those Union troops were black soldiers, some of whom were likely witnessing the liberation of their own city.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Can you imagine the range of emotions they must have been feeling?
It's hard to even fathom. After years of fighting for a nation that denied them basic human rights, they were now marching into the Confederate capital as liberators.
Wow. Just thinking about that gives me chills.
And then just a day later, you have Lincoln himself arriving in Richmond.
Yeah, what a moment that must have been.
He sat at Jefferson Davis's desk, walked the streets among the newly freed people. It was a moment of victory, of course.
But also a moment of quiet reflection, I think.
It's interesting. When I think about Lincoln at that moment, I can't help but think about his second inaugural address, which he delivered just a few weeks before Richmond fell. His words calling for malice toward none and charity for all.
Right.
They seem even more profound, knowing that he was staring down this daunting task of reconstructing a shattered nation.
He understood the deep wounds that needed healing and that it would take more than military victory to bind up the nation's wounds.
Yeah.
Compassion, a commitment to justice,
Yeah.
a willingness to rebuild trust. All of that would be needed.
Sadly, though, he wouldn't live to see that vision through.
Yeah. His assassination just days after Lee's surrender was a devastating blow. It really casts a long shadow over those celebrations of victory and added another layer of complexity to this already challenging task of reconstruction.
It's a stark reminder that even in moments of triumph, darkness can lurk around the corner. Absolutely. But even as the nation mourned Lincoln's death, the war itself was finally coming to a close. Just a few days before the assassination, Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse.
Yeah, and this wasn't just a surrender. This was a symbolic moment.
Oh, absolutely. The way Grant treated Lee and his troops really set the tone for reconciliation, allowing them to return home with their possessions. No treason charges. It was really remarkable.
Yeah. It shows that Grant understood that true victory lay not in crushing the enemy, but in bringing them back into the fold as fellow citizens.
Exactly. And there's this really powerful story about a symbolic handshake.
Oh, yeah, I've heard about this.
Between Lee and Grant's Seneca Indian Secretary, Colonel Ely Parker.
I think I know where this is going.
So Lee says to Parker, I'm glad to see one real American here.
Wow.
And Parker replies, we are all Americans.
That's powerful.
It really encapsulates the idea that even after this incredibly brutal war, they were all ultimately part of one nation.
It's such a good reminder of that shared identity that binds us, even when we're facing these intense conflicts.
Absolutely. And as news of the surrender spreads, Grant actually ordered his troops to stop firing their celebratory salutes.
Wow.
He said, the rebels are our countrymen again. It was a powerful gesture of reconciliation, a signal that the time for healing had come.
But of course, healing takes time, and not everyone was ready to just embrace reconciliation. So the path to a truly unified nation would be long and definitely full of challenges.
And one of the stories that's often overlooked from this period is the delayed emancipation in Texas.
Yeah.
It wasn't until June 19, 1865, over 2 months after Lee's surrender, that Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas to announce the end of slavery.
You know, when I think about Juneteenth, it's a reminder that freedom didn't come overnight for everyone. The news traveled slowly, and for a lot of people, it was met with this mix of joy, disbelief, and uncertainty about the future.
Absolutely. The podcast shares a story of a woman who was emancipated on Juneteenth, and she described the day as this whirlwind of emotions.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Elation at the prospect of being free, of course, but also confusion about what that actually meant, practically, and then fear of what the future held.
It really puts things into perspective, right? Even with the war over and slavery abolished, the road to true equality was just beginning.
Exactly. And you have to remember, the South was in ruins, farms, factories, railroads, all destroyed.
Yeah, the human cost was just staggering.
Yeah.
Over 620,000 lives lost, countless others wounded. And the scars of this conflict ran deep for generations.
And then you've got this massive task of rebuilding the nation, both physically and emotionally.
Yeah, how do you even begin to do that?
Well, Reconstruction was complex. It was crucial. Black Americans who were newly granted rights under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments faced incredible resistance from white Southerners who were determined to hold on to their power.
So it was a time of contradictions then?
Absolutely. You have these moments of real progress, like the establishment of the Freedmen's Bureau, but then you also have the emergence of Jim Crow laws,
Right.
which were specifically designed to segregate and disenfranchise black citizens.
And, of course, you can't forget the rise of the Ku Klux Klan.
Oh, yeah, a terrorist organization that used violence and intimidation to terrorize black communities. It's a stark reminder that the fight for equality was far from over.
And on top of all these physical and political challenges, there's also this battle over the narrative of the war itself.
Right, that's where the lost cause myth comes in.
Okay.
So this narrative emerged in the years after the war, and it romanticized the Confederacy, it downplayed the role of slavery, and it tried to paint this picture of the South as engaged in this noble but lost cause.
It's so interesting how history can be rewritten to serve certain agendas.
It is. And the lost cause myth has had this really lasting impact, unfortunately, shaping the way that generations have viewed the Civil War and its legacy.
It makes you realize how important it is to really critically examine the stories we're told about the past.
Absolutely. We have to look beyond the surface and understand the real complexities and nuances of history.
Especially with something like the Civil War. That kind of critical examination is essential for understanding not just the past, but also how it shapes the present.
Right. The legacies of slavery, racism, and the fight for equality continue to impact our world today.
It really makes you think, huh? About how much the past can impact us even today.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've talked about a lot in this deep dive.
We have.
The final battles.
Yeah.
The struggles of Reconstruction. The legacy of the war.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is. So what do you think is the most important thing we can take away from all of this?
That's a good question. You know, I think for me, it's the resilience of the human spirit.
Okay.
Even in the face of just incredible adversity. You think about those Confederate soldiers facing impossible odds, unimaginable hardships, or the enslaved people who never gave up hope for freedom.
All right.
And then all those people who worked tirelessly to rebuild the nation after the war, to create a more just and equal society. It's really a testament to human strength and the desire for a better future.
Yeah. I think you're right. It's easy to get caught up in the, the tragedy and the brutality.
All right.
But it's important to remember those glimmers of hope.
Absolutely.
Like Grant's generosity, Appomattox, Lincoln's vision for a reunited nation, the celebrations of Juneteenth. These moments show us that even in the darkest of times, there's always a possibility for compassion and healing.
And I think that's such a vital lesson for us to remember, especially today, as we face these challenges of inequality and division in our own time. It's a reminder that progress is possible, even when the path forward seems uncertain.
For sure. The Civil War was a terrible tragedy, but it also pushed the nation towards a better future.
It did, and it continues to push us today.
Yeah.
The Civil War is this powerful reminder that democracy is fragile and the fight for justice never really ends. It's a story that continues to resonate with us, challenging us to learn from the mistakes of the past and work towards a more just and equal future.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to turn things over to our listeners.
Sounds good.
What stories or details from our deep dive resonated with you? How does understanding this pivotal moment in American history inform your view of what's happening in the world today? We encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep making those connections between the past and the present.
It's all connected.
It is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the end of the Civil War and its aftermath.